and welcome to Plant Pod. I'm your host, Robert Romej, and with me today is Senior Pastor of Aspire Church, Brian Hook, and Makenna Ayres. And so this is going to be our first episode that we're releasing, and we just want to start off by giving a little bit of background of ourselves, and then we'll kind of lead into what this podcast is all about. So first of all, Brian, would you kick us off? Give us a little bit about your background.
You know, I have been alive 57 years, just celebrated my 57th birthday. Been in ministry 38 years, so pretty long time. And I'm a pastor. My wife and I have, Jessica, have 4 children, 2 that are married and 2 that are still at home. All 4 of them love Jesus. And and I would say for me, also one of the most important things heading into Super Bowl week here, I'm a 49er fan. And I was born in San Francisco, so I have some background of living in California as well as Arizona. But yeah, I love the Niners, love Mexican food, so I'm in a great place here in Tucson to live. Just me in general, I'm a Gen Xer, so I kind of grew up in the Reagan generation, you know. So, and I'm also grew up Baptist. I wrestled with my faith early on, so I'm conservative. I'm conservative in many different areas of my life. So conservative theologically, conservative. I wouldn't label myself Republican, but I am conservative in my views, politically, fiscally, all that. And I'm very liberal. I'm also very liberal. So if you're listening and you're like, hey, I'm kind of liberal too, let me explain that. I'm liberal as it relates to sharing my faith. And we're a church plant, so I'm very liberal in how we share our faith with others. So I'm very open to different ways that we share our faith, different types of churches. I think there's so many different types of churches out there. There's, as far as conservative belief system and believing in the Bible, we can plant churches in so many different ways because God is a creative God. So conservative and liberal. And boy, when I'm around people that are conservative and liberal in that regard, I'm just excited to be around them. And so I know you guys are too. So you're that type of people. So, hey, we're doing a podcast for people that will enjoy different ways that we can share our faith and expand the kingdom and give God glory. So
I love that. Yeah. Makenna, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, well, my name's Makenna. I was born and raised in Southern California. And yeah, I'm passionate about people. I'm passionate about the kingdom. I'm kind of nerdy. I love animals and bird watching. If you ever hang out with me, I'm going to be outside identifying all the birds that we hear flying around outside. I relate to you in being conservative, but also, just being liberal and open to getting people into the kingdom and what that looks like and sharing our faith. Super passionate about church planting. I want to see in our generation the expanse of church planting and making it a norm for churches and churches planting other churches. Yeah, I have a husband. We've been married for about 1.5 years, but we've been together almost 9 years. So we started dating the summer before our freshman year of high school. So have been together quite some time. No kids yet. We do have 2 cats, but I know a lot of people don't like cats. We're cat and dog people, but in an apartment, dogs are harder. So cats at the moment. But yeah, just love God, love people, and I'm so excited to be on the podcast.
I know, me too. Well, I'll give a little bit of background about myself. My name is Rob Romej. I grew up in Arizona, so I was born and raised in Sierra Vista, moved to Tucson when I finished off my undergrad degree in mechanical engineering. I am married. I have a wife. Her name is Carly. We don't have any kids. We do have a dog. I'm definitely a dog person. His name is Kevin, by the way. Everyone has to know Kevin.
he looks like a Kevin too.
Right?
He's just,
right.
Yeah, that's good.
Kevin the
Yeah, so I went and after studying mechanical engineering, I worked as a mechanical engineer for about 8 years here in the Tucson area. And now I work full time with our church, and I'm super excited and grateful for that, something that I definitely never would have seen coming. I remember following Jesus very distinctly, making the decision back in 2nd grade, but I didn't really start owning it until my mid-20s. And so I'm also a 90s kid, so I was born in 1990 and lived that out. And so here we are today. I'm also nerdy, but in a different way. I'm really excited about this podcast, for one. I'm excited because I listen to a lot of podcasts. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. And so there's so much good conversation that I've gotten a chance to be around with the people that Brian, that we've gotten a chance to meet through the Imagine Church Planning Training, all these things that will probably come out and be fleshed out through the course of this podcast. So for that, us to be able to capture some of those moments, to capture a little bit about church planning, or hopefully a lot about church planning, a little bit about just what that is to be a part of a church plant and just church in general. I'm really excited. I'm excited to kind of dive into some of those things.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
me too.
So yeah, let's this podcast is Plant Pod, but we're all part of Aspire Church here in the Tucson area. It's planted in the foothills. You want to kind of expand on that a little bit about what Aspire Church is, and just talk a little bit about, even though this podcast is directly associated to Aspire Church, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of its own thing, but it's all connected.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind, you want to talk a little bit about how we started?
I would love that.
I think that, since we're talking about planting, I think it's important to talk about, how we started. And even though I've been in ministry a long time, different types of churches, mega church, churches in transition, churches that were about to die that were able to, see God burst, breathe life into. And so, but I like church planning. And I think that we're in a season in our world, and specifically in the American church, where you may have not been a part of church planning or been interested in it, but I think all of us now as pastors are church planners. We have to think differently. Number one, just to survive, but to see new things birth, and we're in a new season. And so, for my wife and I, we were at a mission conference at Hope Church where I was serving as a lead pastor under senior pastor Vance Pittman. And, I was just really tired that day. And I remember just wanting to take a break. And so I sat on the back row of the church. My wife was there. And Dr. Danny Aiken was preaching on Romans 15:20. And he was talking about Paul aspiring to preach the gospel where others had not heard about Jesus. Thus to not lay on another man's foundation. And so I really sense God calling us to plant another church. We'd already planted a church in the Phoenix area years previous, and we'd been helping church planters, but I was real happy with just helping planters to do this, really helping planters take that step of faith. But God was speaking to me in that moment from his word. So it was a word from the word to plant a church. And I thought, I got to study this passage more. Is this really about church planting? Because I thought there's two outs. Number one, contextually, I have it wrong. Or my wife Jessica didn't hear the same thing. Because if she didn't hear it, I'm out. If contextually I'm missing it, no, actually that passage is talking about Paul later in life wanting to continue to plant churches. And so that was a powerful word. And then the out was Jessica didn't hear that. But she did. We got in her car. I said, did God speak to you about anything? And she said, I think God's calling us to plant another church. And so that was
so
huge. So there's about, hundreds of things that we're going to talk to you about over the course of this podcast of how that came about. Because I think calling is so important, right? And but I think the seed of that happened in Las Vegas. And then we moved here. And I remember a few months after moving here, we were just really just kind of going through some depression because it was hard. It's hard to plant churches. And leaving the home church and then coming here, we wanted to wait a couple of years before we started any kind of, worship service. We just wanted to see people come to know Christ. And my wife was walking and she met a lady named Rose, and Rose Hunter. And Rose passed away last week. So I'm thinking of her today. Just, her really reaching out to my wife and her daughter who was walking that time. And she heard my wife say Faith, and that's our daughter's name. And she said, oh, that Faith, that's a Christian name. And so the conversation kind of went that Rose was actually praying at that moment when my wife met her. And it turns out Rose had been praying for a church, a Bible-believing, Spirit-led church to be birthed in the Catalina foothills. She'd been doing it for years. And so we thought we were going there to plant this church, but the reality is God planted this church. God plants churches.
That's good.
So I think it's important to know right up front, we don't plant churches. God does. And he plants the seed of gospel in us. And I think every church needs to be the response of the prayers of his people. And so Rose actually planted the church, if you want to technically nail who did this. So we were just walking in that, and I've talked to church planners, numerous church planners over the years. You can trace it back to a man or woman of faith praying that church into existence.
That's so cool.
And
Yeah.
so,
That is good.
so that's kind of a little bit of a background, but I think the whole podcast that we'll be doing over the next few weeks, months, will really be about this calling and how you plan. So I'll leave that for maybe a future
That sounds good.
podcast. Yeah.
That's good.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well,
How about you guys? I mean, here's what I'd like to know. How old are you, Rob?
I'm 33.
33.
Almost 23.
23. So 23, 33, the average age in our community, which is really, I would say, the wealth center of our city, 1.5 million. The wealth center of our city is the foothills. So the leadership of our city is here in the foothills. But the average age is probably 55.
It is.
so-
It is. I've done my research.
Yeah.
55.
So I'm curious, why aspire to you? What caused you to be a part?
Oh yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I can start.
Yeah.
So, in my upbringing, like I had mentioned before, I started following Jesus as a second grader, for whatever that's worth, whatever a second grader knows, right? But I grew up most of my life calling myself a Christian, but I never actually had someone to show me how it's done. Now, I'll back up a little bit. My mom taught me to pray. I grew up in a household where we talked about God and stuff, but we went to church. It was more of a thing to go to on a Sunday or maybe a Wednesday for youth group. And I didn't even really go to a Sunday gathering, like hardly at all growing up. And so I was very hungry once I graduated college to really just understand it more. I saw people in a small group that I was a part of just really like on fire for Jesus. And I was like, man, I'm missing that. So that's really what sparked me to take my faith seriously. But yet I kept asking. I was a part of a different church here in the Tucson area, one of the really big churches. And not that there's anything wrong with the big church, but I had asked one of the leaders that I knew, because I didn't really know a lot of leaders. I didn't know them. They didn't know me. But the one that I did know, I asked him, hey, is there someone that I could talk to on a regular basis? Is there someone that I could ask questions with, maybe get together every week, a couple times a month, something like that? Like, I have questions and I want, what I didn't know, I didn't have the words for it, is I was asking for discipleship.
Yeah.
And, I read that now, I see that, and I read it then too. And so I was asking for it, I was craving it. And I just remember his response was something of the sort of like, I have to give that some thought. There was some pause. And he got back to me maybe about a week later or something like that. And anyway, it was more of it wasn't something natural, right? So I thought, oh, this is not normal. I'm asking for something that's kind of out of the ordinary. Anyway, you fast forward a little bit, and I was looking for a church closer to where I live, because that church I was a part of was about like 30, 35 minutes away. And, when you start to stack things up, when people start doing little events, when people, hey, come over, we're going to barbecue. Well, that distance, even though when I was younger, I thought, oh, that's no big deal, but all of a sudden it's like I start missing more and more. It's like, that's an hour. It's an hour and a half, out of my time. And I would love to, but so I was missing more. So I was like, I want to be a part of a church community that's close to where I live. And so I started looking at different things, and I saw online that there was this church, but there wasn't a whole lot of information about it. I stumbled in January 2019, had no idea that it was the second service that Aspire had, and I was like, oh, this is a new church plant. This is different than anything I've experienced. And within just a matter of weeks, all of a sudden, the senior pastor, you, Brian, is texting me, and like, my name. And even the other leadership, it wasn't just you, other leadership reaching out, asking how I'm doing. And it was a whole new experience, because other than a handshake at the door, I didn't know, never really talked to any pastor. And so that was just different. I saw that there was something that was different. And there also, it was helpful because we were going through something, and I was like, hey, I see that you guys have different sound people. What's going on? And there was an area to serve. So that was a big deal to me too. I was like, oh, I can help out in this church here. Other churches I've been to, they've got it all figured out. At least I think they do, right? It looks like they do. And so an area to serve, and I started to see just that discipleship as I grew to know you more, other leaders. And I had eventually reached out to you and just said, hey, I asked you the same question, you called me up one day, which was also really cool that the pastor called me. I thought that was pretty
Yeah.
cool. And, I said, hey, I'm looking for someone that could walk through stuff with me. And long story short, you volunteered to do that. And that was very impactful in my own life. And so we started meeting on a weekly basis and just walking through things. And so that's kind of how I got to Aspire, and in kind of a long story short kind of manner. But I think it was just really impactful that I started to see things lived out in the Bible that I was reading, and start to kind of like put some names and words to things that I was craving, like discipleship and just authenticity. And I saw an impact in my own life in small group. And so to be a part of a church that's a church of small groups was huge to me. I'm like, oh, I've never seen that be the focus. Never seen discipleship be the focus. And what does that mean? And so all of those things just started to definitely resonate with me. And I quickly was like, I want this to be my home. I love these people, and so that's how I ended up pretty much at Aspire Church.
That's
Yeah.
so good. I love that.
Wow, it's interesting. You mentioned that previous church, nothing, and I'm glad you didn't name the pastor and everything, so we can talk about him freely.
Yeah.
Didn't really have an idea about discipleship.
Right.
Didn't really, have a clue about, or at least didn't want
Right.
to go there. And then just just you're shocked that a pastor would call you or text you. I think that's pretty interesting too.
Yeah, that was very impactful.
But that seems like that should be kind of the norm, right? I mean,
Well,
I'm
that's
not
what-
gonna- we shouldn't
right.
highlight Aspire and
Sure.
say, "Wow,
Sure.
Right.
the pastor called you."
Right.
Well, that should be kind of I've been
should
doing
be
this for a
normal.
while. That should be a norm. That should
Right.
be a normal. There should never be a time when the pastor doesn't reach out to you. It doesn't have to be the senior pastor,
Sure.
Right.
but somebody
Right.
in leadership should probably reach out. But that's interesting. Relationship discipleship. I think that's what I'd love to see us talk about in the weeks ahead or months ahead. How to disciple. What is a disciple? How do we build relationships? Where do we fail in that sometimes? Even talk about our failures.
Yeah.
I think it'd be good because we haven't arrived at all on either
Right.
of those,
Right.
relationship or discipleship. We haven't cracked the code.
Right.
I think it's important for people that are listening to know we haven't arrived at all.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that I've also really appreciated about just doing life with you and with the people in our church body is we have not arrived,
Yeah.
but that is our focus. So we're going to do what we can. And we've, over the years that I've gotten the chance to be a part of some of this, we've changed things because we've said,
Yeah.
hey guys, I don't know that we're doing it
Yeah.
the best way. This
Yeah.
is how the world's doing it. Let's see, not the world, the church around the world is what I
Yeah.
mean when I say that. Like, hey, this is how they're doing it overseas. Should
Yeah.
we consider that? So, never coming to a
Yeah.
place of arrival, but a place of let's always do it better. Let's never just settle. Let's
Yeah.
do things a little different, right? Let's think a
Yeah.
little bit outside the box, like you kind
Yeah.
of started off this podcast talking about that.
Yeah,
Hopefully
that's good.
this is full of that kind of dialogue, right? Because if probably something this podcast isn't going to be is, how you can add 1,000 people to your role in the
Right.
next year, or
Sure.
that's probably not. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing if you guys are doing that in your church. Right? That's not going to be this.
Yeah.
How to triple in a few weeks. That's probably not going to be it. But I do want to grapple with that. The relationships and discipleship. That's what people are really looking for. At least I think they should be. So but I'm hearing people that aren't believers are longing for that,
Right.
even though they may not be
Yeah.
able to pinpoint those
Right.
words. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Makenna, how about you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just love that, Rob. That's so
That's
good. And
awesome.
I see a lot of similarities in our stories. Maybe what we were missing and what we found at Aspire. And so I got saved when I was 7. So grew up in the church, grew up in a family that just loves Jesus and always taught me about Jesus and his love for me. And I got saved at 7 and kind of just never turned back. So I felt that internal call, that gospel call when I was 7 and gave my life to Christ. And then somewhere in my early high school years, I felt the external call, that call to ministry. And so had that affirmed in me by the leadership at my church and was invited to apply to the BAT program. Shout out to all my BAT kids. So BAT is Bachelor of Applied Theology at CBU, my alma mater.
Sporting the sweater. Good for you.
At California Baptist University. So I studied theology, specifically theology applied to life, right? So for people who want to go into ministry or some kind of ministerial occupation, and the director of my program, Greg Cochran, who you know,
I do know Greg, yeah.
is kind of how we got to Aspire. So my husband, my wonderful husband Nathan, he is an electrical engineer, and between our junior and senior year, we both went to CBU. Between our junior and senior year, he got an internship with Texas Instruments here in Tucson. And so we got married in May of 2022, packed up our bags, and then a week later moved to Tucson.
Awesome.
And
Shout out to TI.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you,
Shout out to
Texas.
TI.
Thank you, Texas Instruments.
Thank
Yeah,
you, TI,
that's
for that. But we knew that we were going to be here for 3 months. And so, you know, we could have watched our home church online, but there's something different about being in person and experiencing community.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked Dr. Cochran, because I know he has connections, much like you, Brian, all over the nation, just knows lots of people. And I said, hey, we're going to be in Tucson, Arizona for 3 months. Do you happen to know of any churches or pastors in the area that we can get connected to? And he said, you know what, I do. And so he took out a little sticky note and a pen, and he wrote down Brian Hook. And he said, I know a pastor that recently planted in the area. He's a great guy. I think you should start your search there. So I opened my laptop, searched up Brian Hook, Tucson, Arizona, found the Aspire page. I looked through the value statements, not that I didn't trust Dr. Cochran, but wanted to know what we were looking at, agreed with the value statements and the mission statement. And so that's where we started our search when we moved out here. We went the first Sunday after we had moved out. Hadn't even unpacked all of our belongings in our apartment yet, but we made it to church on Sunday, and Rob was one of the very first people Nathan and I met, and immediately greeted us and made us feel welcome. And then just hearing your sermon and it being just verse by verse, and we had come from a mega church, which I love, and no disrespect to them, but that was just something we weren't used to, was verse by verse preaching straight out of the Bible. And just immediately getting welcomed. And I think like 3 different families invited us over to their house within like the first week we were here. So it was just something we were completely unfamiliar with, and we're invited to join a small group. And you called us later that day. We were doing our grocery shopping at Trader Joe's and got a call from Rob and said, hey, loved meeting you guys, this morning, and want to invite you to come back and check out our small group. And that week you texted Nathan and I said, hey, loved meeting you guys on Sunday. How about we get coffee and chat? And I was kind of the same way, Rob. That was just like, that wasn't even on my radar. That is nothing, even though I had grown up in the church my whole life, I had been at the same church, and again, loved them dearly and loved the church and love what they're doing. But that was just something so unfamiliar to me, that you could have, relationship with the pastoral staff, and that people really cared about you. And so we weren't just another number walking through the door. You guys cared about us. And so so we stayed at Aspire. It was pretty easy to make that decision. So we were there for 3 months, and then we both had a year of school left. So packed our bags and moved back to Southern California. I finished my degree in applied theology. Nathan finished his degree in electrical engineering. And then by the Lord's grace, he got offered a full-time position with TI. So shout out TI again.
Yeah.
And knowing that we had, no biological family here whatsoever, all of our biological families in Southern California, we knew that we had a church family. And so the decision was pretty easy for us to decide to accept that position, move back out here, and we've been here ever since. And I've gotten the pleasure of just taking on some serving opportunities, and get plugged in and get asked, what are your spiritual gifts? What do you like doing? What fills you up? Where do you feel like the Lord is calling you? And getting to use those gifts to edify the body and to pour into others, and being discipled for the first time in a long time, which is just crazy. And not only being discipled, but getting to disciple others. And it's just been such a gift. And the Lord has been so gracious to us. And even when it did not make sense for us, getting married and moving to Tucson a week later, and, not knowing financially what was going to happen, and all these different factors. And yet, the Lord's just been good, and that's his character, right? He is good, and he's a provider. So now we're out here and living our best life in Tucson, Arizona, and could not be happier about being part of Aspire.
That's great. That's great news. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
There you go again. Relationships.
Right. Yeah. There's a theme there.
That's huge.
We didn't plan that, but
No,
that's true.
we
It's
did
really the authenticity's coming out, right?
Yeah.
That's good.
That's good.
Well, I think as we lead into kind of wrapping up this episode, but lead into the next episode, Let's just briefly talk about it. I mean, I think people are going to get it at this point, but we're naming this podcast Plant Pod.
Plant pod.
Why do we pick? We deliberated, right? We tossed out a bunch of different things. We can even name some of those if we want
Some
to.
were better than others.
Some are better than others. Let's talk about that. Plant Pod. I think there was a whole bunch. But why did we land on Plant Pod, Brian?
I think, keeping it to church planting, that's who we are. So I think the most authentic thing we can do is to be who we are. And we are a church plant. We are not a mega church, even though I think mega churches will benefit from hearing what we talk about, because I think mega churches should thrive to and strive to plant churches, be a part of church planting. So I think you'll glean some information. Also, I've been a part of mega churches. And it's so refreshing to hear just some of the struggles, that we go through, even though it is a struggle. To hear some of the struggles, actually, wow, they're struggling in that area. I can help. Or, wow, it's been a long time since I struggled in that area. And it kind of helps people to know what we're going through. And I think if you're a church planner as well, you go to conferences, and I don't know, sometimes I leave conferences depressed sometimes, because I think our church will never attain to what that guy shares. And what people don't know, because I've spoken at some conferences now, you share your best of the best of the best of the best day.
Right.
You don't share the struggles. And I think it's important to have a podcast where we do share our struggles. And hopefully some church planners out there will listen just to hear some of the commonality. And sometimes going through it and sharing it allows other people to know, wow, they're dealing with it as well. And that'll help them, I think, to stay in the game, to stay, to not bail on it. Because I think as church planners, if you're listening here and you are a church planner, you probably think about maybe throwing in the towel about every month. And it's a struggle. And I think sharing those things will be good for people to know, to keep going, So, yeah. So Plant Pod.
Yeah,
Plant
I love
pod.
it.
Yeah.
I love it. Do you have anything to add? Anything?
Yeah, no, I love that. That is, you're right, just the heart of this podcast is a church planning podcast. And I know we discussed too, just that scripture is rich with imagery of, planting the seed and letting the Lord grow that, right? And so that's our goal here is we'll plant those seeds, and some others may come along and water it, but ultimately the Lord is what makes something grow.
That's good.
And so I just love that imagery all through scripture, and I think it's cute also.
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe that's just me, but I think it's cute, it's catchy, and I also just have a heart to see.
And we have it.
We
We have a
We
plant
do.
on the
We have
bookshelf too.
several
Yeah, for those
plants.
listening, we got some plants. You can just picture them in your head. We've got some plants behind us
They're
here.
green, they are lush. I just love it. And like I said earlier, I'm just excited to see church planting become the norm, like you said, with small churches, mega churches. And because right now in the US, we're at a deficit. More churches close their doors every year than churches that are planted. And so we are decreasing, which is it's a very sad reality. And without people being passionate about planting churches, that will only get worse. And so I'm excited to come alongside potential church planners, current church planners, and get other people excited about church planting. And just, ultimately it's the Lord's vision, right? Is that his church would be multiplied, and that his people would reach other people, and that he would be glorified, his kingdom would expand. So I'm just stoked about that. And I think Plant Pod is all encompassing of those things.
That's good.
I love it. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on our first episode. Join us next time on our episode 2, where we're going to talk a little bit more about why exactly we would do an entire podcast on church planting, and dive in a little bit deeper, just to give you a little bit more idea of where we're hoping to head with this podcast. So thank you for joining us today. Thanks guys.
Thanks,
Thank
Rob.
you.
You bet.